Greetings, wanderers. Tonight, we drift back to ancient Egypt, where being chosen by the gods to rule as pharaoh wasn't a blessing. It was a curse wrapped in gold. Picture having ultimate power but living in constant fear of assassination, bearing cosmic responsibility for the entire universe, and facing genetic consequences of divine bloodlines that would make modern medicine cringe. If you find comfort in these gentle explorations of history's stranger corners, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if my words give you peace of mind. And before you drift too deep into the past, do leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious to know how these old stories find you in your corner of the world. Very well, it's time we settle in, dim the lights, and discover why the most powerful people in the ancient world lived lives of unimaginable suffering. Picture yourself being the most powerful person in the known world, yet you can't trust anyone around you. Your guards might be plotting your death. Your wives might be organizing conspiracies. Even your own children could be planning your assassination. This was the daily reality for Egyptian pharaohs, and the paranoia was absolutely justified. Out of approximately 170 pharaohs who ruled Egypt over 3,000 years, only 2 successful assassinations are definitively documented. That sounds pretty safe, doesn't it? But multiple conspiracy attempts and assassination plots were documented across different dynasties, creating what scholars call a general climate of suspicion that pervaded royal life. Think about it like being president knowing there have been multiple White House coup attempts throughout history. Even if most failed, every staff meeting feels like a potential ambush. That's exactly how pharaohs lived. The first confirmed assassination was Amenemhat I, murdered around 1958 BCE. What makes this particularly chilling is that it happened during the night while his son was away leading a military campaign. The pharaoh was killed in his sleep by his own palace guards, the very people whose job was to protect him. The story was preserved in the instructions of King Amenemhat to his son and the story of Sinu. Sinu was a palace guard who overheard the assassination plot and fled into the desert, terrified he'd be blamed. His story gives us a glimpse into the absolute terror that gripped the palace when conspiracies were discovered. The conspirators weren't outsiders or foreign enemies. They were individuals from the royal household and administrative elite who had daily access to the pharaoh. It's like being betrayed by your personal security team, your closest advisors, and your household staff all at once. But the most documented assassination was Ramesses III in 1155 BCE. This case is so well preserved that modern forensic scientists have examined the actual mummy. In 2012, CT scans revealed a deep throat wound that cut through both his esophagus and trachea. Someone had literally cut the pharaoh's throat. The Judicial Papyrus of Turin gives us a complete record of the conspiracy trial. This was a carefully planned coup involving over 30 conspirators, including palace officials, soldiers, priests, and magicians, who used wax figurines to weaken the pharaoh before the physical attack. The mastermind was Queen Tut, a secondary wife who wanted her son Pentower on the throne. She recruited Pebikamen, the pantry chief, Mastasuria, the butler, Panheboni, the cattle overseer, and even the royal physician. Today, if your spouse organized a coup with your personal trainer, your accountant, your doctor, and your security team, you'd consider that the ultimate betrayal. That's exactly what happened to Ramesses III. 28 people were executed in total. Prince Pentower was forced to commit suicide. 4 corrupted judges had their ears and noses cut off. The punishments were swift and brutal. The embalmers who prepared Ramesses III's body discovered that his toe was missing, suggesting multiple attackers had participated in the murder. They performed what we might call ancient plastic surgery, inserting a Horus eye amulet into the throat wound to hide the violence. Other documented cases paint an equally disturbing picture. Pharaoh Teti was killed by his own bodyguards, according to historian Manetho. Pepi I survived an assassination attempt serious enough to be recorded in tomb inscriptions. The security dilemma pharaohs faced was essentially unsolvable. They needed advisors and guards to run their kingdom, but these same people had the access necessary to kill them. Even the term pharaoh originally meant great house, referring to the building, not the person inside it. Modern security experts understand something ancient pharaohs learned the hard way. The most dangerous threats always come from inside your own organization. Today's executives worry about insider threats and employee sabotage. Ancient pharaohs faced the same problems, except the stakes weren't money or reputation, but literally life and death. The assassination of Ramesses III deserves deeper examination, because it reveals just how dangerous royal family life could become. This wasn't a case of political enemies or foreign agents infiltrating the palace. This was the pharaoh's own wife organizing his murder, and the conspiracy she created was so sophisticated it would make modern intelligence agencies take notes. Queen Tut wasn't the great royal wife, but a secondary wife, which meant her son Pentower was not the designated heir. In the complex hierarchy of Egyptian royal marriages, this put her in a precarious position. The pharaoh might have dozens of wives, but only one would be the mother of the next pharaoh. Competition between royal wives wasn't just about affection or status, but about their children's survival. Here's where it gets really interesting. Tai didn't just recruit a few disgruntled palace workers. She built what intelligence analysts would recognize as a sophisticated spy network. The conspiracy included people at every level of palace operations. The pantry chief controlled access to the pharaoh's food. The butler had access to his private chambers. The harem overseer could coordinate with other royal wives. But the most chilling aspect was the involvement of the royal physician and the court magician. These weren't just political allies, but people who had intimate knowledge of the pharaoh's physical condition and daily routines. The physician knew when Ramesses would be most vulnerable. The magician provided psychological warfare through curses and supernatural intimidation. The conspirators even used what we might call ancient psychological operations. They created wax figurines of the pharaoh and performed spells designed to weaken his mental state. While we might dismiss this as superstition, the psychological effect on someone who genuinely believed in magic would have been devastating. Imagine knowing that people you trusted were actively cursing you, trying to sap your strength and cloud your judgment. The timing was carefully planned around the beautiful festival of the valley, a major religious celebration when the palace would be full of visitors and normal security routines would be disrupted. Modern terrorists use the same strategy, targeting times when security is focused on managing large crowds rather than protecting specific individuals. The network they built was designed to create a kingdom-wide rebellion, not just a palace coup. The conspirators planned to use the pharaoh's death as a signal for broader uprising that would put Pentower on the throne with popular support. This wasn't just about killing one person, but about overthrowing the entire government. What makes this conspiracy particularly disturbing is how it reveals the complete breakdown of trust within the royal family. Queen Tut was willing to murder her husband to advance her son's interests, but Prince Pentower was also willing to see his father killed to gain the throne. Royal family dinners must have been exercises in paranoia, with everyone wondering who might be planning whose death. The investigation that followed reads like a modern crime thriller. The authorities conducted extensive interrogations, tracked financial records, and examined the conspirators' personal correspondence. Several conspirators were forced to commit suicide, which was considered a more honorable death than execution. But here's the most unsettling detail. Queen Te's ultimate fate wasn't recorded in the official documents. This suggests she might have received the worst punishment of all, being burned alive, which was reserved for the most heinous crimes, and was considered so terrible that scribes wouldn't even write about it directly. It's like a reality TV show where everyone is married to the same person. They're all competing for inheritance, and losing means death. That was royal family dinner every night. The assassination attempts we've documented represent only the tip of the iceberg. For every successful murder, there were probably dozens of failed plots, near misses, and conspiracies that were discovered before they could be implemented. The palace of an Egyptian pharaoh was essentially a high-security prison where the most dangerous inmates were the guards themselves. Consider the structural problems that made pharaohs so vulnerable. Unlike modern heads of state who can delegate authority to trusted officials, pharaohs were expected to maintain personal control over every aspect of government. This meant they had to work closely with large numbers of people who had both the access and the motivation to kill them. The vizier, for example, was essentially the pharaoh's chief of staff, with enormous power over daily operations. But this same position gave the vizier detailed knowledge of the pharaoh's routines, weaknesses, and security arrangements. Several documented assassination attempts involved corrupt viziers who used their privileged access to coordinate attacks. Palace officials came from competing noble families who had their own political agendas and dynastic ambitions. Giving someone a position in the royal administration wasn't just about finding qualified personnel, but about managing complex webs of family loyalty and political obligation. Every appointment was a potential security risk, but the pharaoh couldn't run the kingdom without delegation. The royal bodyguard system was particularly problematic. Guards needed to be physically close to the pharaoh to protect him, but this same physical proximity made them perfect assassination weapons. The murder of Pharaoh Teti by his own bodyguards wasn't an isolated incident, but the logical outcome of a security system that had fundamental structural flaws. Even religious officials couldn't be trusted completely. Priests controlled enormous resources and had their own political interests. They could access the pharaoh during religious ceremonies when his guard might be down. Some conspiracy theories suggest that certain pharaohs were poisoned during religious rituals, when they were expected to consume special foods or drinks that could be easily contaminated. The palace's physical layout made security even more challenging. Unlike modern buildings designed with security in mind, ancient palaces were built for ceremony and display. They had multiple entrances, complex corridors, and numerous rooms where attackers could hide. The pharaoh's private quarters were often located deep within the palace complex, which meant any attack would have to get past multiple layers of security. But it also meant that if security was compromised, the pharaoh would be trapped with no escape routes. Court ceremonies that were designed to demonstrate the pharaoh's divine power actually made him more vulnerable to attack. When he appeared in public, surrounded by crowds of courtiers and officials, it was impossible to monitor everyone's intentions. The formal protocols that required people to approach the pharaoh in specific ways could be manipulated by assassins who understood the system. The psychological toll of living under constant threat cannot be overstated. Pharaohs developed elaborate paranoia that affected every aspect of their lives. They couldn't eat food without wondering if it was poisoned. They couldn't sleep without wondering if their guards were planning to kill them. They couldn't trust their wives, their children, or their closest advisors. Some pharaohs dealt with this stress by becoming increasingly isolated, limiting their contact with potential threats. But isolation created its own problems. A pharaoh who couldn't work effectively with his officials couldn't govern effectively. Others became increasingly brutal, using executions and torture to intimidate potential conspirators. But brutality created enemies who might not have existed otherwise. The constant security concerns also affected succession planning. Pharaohs had to be careful about designating heirs too early, because this could create rival power centers within the palace. But waiting too long could create succession crises that would destabilize the kingdom. Modern executives worry about corporate espionage and insider threats, but they can hire security consultants, install surveillance systems, and implement background checks. Ancient pharaohs had none of these tools. They were essentially flying blind, trying to identify threats using nothing but their own intuition and the advice of people who might themselves be conspirators. Living as a pharaoh meant accepting that assassination was not just possible, but probable. The question wasn't whether someone would try to kill you, but when they would try, and whether you'd be smart enough to see it coming. In a world where ultimate power came with ultimate vulnerability, paranoia wasn't a psychological disorder, but a survival skill. Wake up every morning knowing that the fate of the entire universe depends on your personal performance. If the Nile doesn't flood properly, it's your fault. If crops fail, you've lost divine favor. If earthquakes happen, you've disrupted cosmic order. This wasn't metaphorical responsibility, but genuine belief that the pharaoh was personally accountable for maintaining Mad, the cosmic principle of truth and order that held reality together. Mad wasn't just a religious concept, but the fundamental law of physics in ancient Egyptian understanding. Without Mad, the sun wouldn't rise, the Nile wouldn't flood, and chaos would consume the world. The pharaoh's job was to maintain this cosmic balance through daily rituals, proper religious observances, and moral behavior that would keep the gods happy and the universe functioning. Modern presidents get blamed for the economy, unemployment rates, and natural disasters that happen during their terms. But imagine if people genuinely believed that your personal spiritual condition controlled whether hurricanes formed, whether stock markets crashed, and whether earthquakes struck. That's the level of responsibility Egyptian pharaohs carried every single day. The pharaoh was considered the sole intermediary between the divine realm and human society. Every prayer, every offering, every religious ceremony in the entire kingdom was ultimately channeled through his divine authority. If communication with the gods broke down, it was because the pharaoh had failed in his cosmic duties. The pressure was not just political, but existential. Consider what this meant in practical terms. When the Nile's annual flood was too low, crops would fail and people would starve. When it was too high, villages would be destroyed and disease would spread. The pharaoh couldn't control the Nile's behavior, but he was held responsible for it anyway. His religious performance was literally a matter of life and death for millions of people. The daily burden of maintaining cosmic order required an exhausting schedule of religious obligations. The pharaoh had to perform purification rituals before dawn, make offerings to dozens of different deities throughout the day, and participate in evening ceremonies that would ensure the sun would rise again tomorrow. These weren't optional activities, but cosmic maintenance work that couldn't be delegated to anyone else. Every temple in Egypt was theoretically under the pharaoh's direct religious authority. He was simultaneously the high priest of Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and hundreds of other deities. While local priests could perform routine ceremonies, the most important rituals required the pharaoh's personal participation. This meant he had to travel constantly, visiting temples across the kingdom to fulfill his religious obligations. The concept of royal divinity created a terrible paradox. The pharaoh was supposed to be a living god, but he was also responsible for maintaining cosmic order through his human actions. If he made mistakes, got sick, or showed any sign of weakness, it could be interpreted as evidence that he was losing divine favor. He had to be perfect at all times, because imperfection could literally end the world. Seasonal festivals required the pharaoh's presence at specific times and locations. The beautiful festival of the valley, the Apit festival, and dozens of other religious celebrations couldn't proceed without royal participation. But these festivals were scheduled according to cosmic cycles, not the pharaoh's convenience. He had to be in the right place at the right time, performing the right rituals, regardless of his personal health or political crises. It's like being customer service for the entire universe, and every natural disaster is a one-star review of your performance. Modern presidents get blamed for the economy. Pharaohs got blamed for the weather, earthquakes, and whether the Nile flooded properly. Being treated as a living god sounds appealing, until you realize the daily performance requirements. The pharaoh couldn't just claim divinity. He had to demonstrate it constantly through an exhausting schedule of religious ceremonies that began before dawn and continued until late at night. These weren't symbolic activities, but essential cosmic maintenance that kept the universe functioning. The morning purification ceremonies were particularly elaborate. The pharaoh had to be awakened before sunrise, bathed in sacred water, dressed in specific garments, and anointed with oils that had been blessed by priests. Every step followed precise protocols that had been developed over thousands of years. Missing a single element could disrupt the cosmic order and bring disaster to the kingdom. The said festival, held every 30 years, was designed to prove that the pharaoh was still cosmically fit to rule. This involved elaborate physical and spiritual ordeals that tested whether the gods still supported him. Pharaohs who failed these tests could be seen as having lost divine authority. But pharaohs who succeeded faced the knowledge that they'd have to prove themselves again in another 30 years. The religious calendar was relentless. The pharaoh had specific obligations for every day of the year, with some days requiring multiple ceremonies in different locations. The Apit festival alone lasted for 27 days and required the pharaoh's continuous participation in processions, offerings, and rituals. During this period, he essentially lived in the temple, performing religious duties from dawn to dusk. What made this particularly challenging was that the pharaoh had to maintain his divine image while dealing with very human bodily functions. He couldn't be seen eating, drinking, or using the bathroom in ways that would remind people of his mortality. Special protocols governed everything from how he consumed food to how he relieved himself, ensuring that even his most basic human needs were performed in ways that maintained his divine status. The offering of mat to the gods was shown in temple iconography as one of the pharaoh's key duties. But this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. The pharaoh was literally responsible for presenting cosmic order to the divine realm on behalf of all humanity. If this offering was rejected by the gods, it could signal the beginning of cosmic chaos that would destroy civilization. Some rituals required the pharaoh to fast for days before performing them, weakening his physical condition while demanding peak spiritual performance. Others required him to remain awake for entire nights, maintaining vigil over sacred objects or participating in ceremonies that couldn't be interrupted. The physical toll of these obligations was enormous, but there was no allowance for human weakness. The pharaoh also had to perform what were called Sehotep Sekhmet rituals to appease the angry goddess during dangerous transitions. Sekhmet was associated with plague, war, and destruction, and only the pharaoh's direct intervention could prevent her from unleashing devastation on Egypt. These rituals were particularly stressful because failure could result in immediate and visible consequences. Religious obligations never paused, even during illness or military campaigns. If the pharaoh was too sick to perform a crucial ceremony, it would be interpreted as evidence that he was losing divine favor. If he was away fighting wars, arrangements had to be made to ensure that essential rituals continued in his absence. The cosmic responsibilities never took breaks for human convenience. Modern method actors who stay in character between takes have nothing on pharaohs, who had to maintain their divine performance 24 hours a day for their entire lives. There was no off switch, no time when they could simply be human beings rather than living gods. The terrifying reality for pharaohs was that their cosmic responsibilities could fail spectacularly. And when they did, the consequences were visible to everyone. Natural disasters, military defeats, and economic collapses were all interpreted as evidence that the pharaoh had lost divine favor, creating political crises that could destroy dynasties. Akhenaten's religious reforms provide the most dramatic example of what happened when divine order collapsed. His attempt to replace traditional Egyptian religion with worship of a single god, the Aten, was seen by most Egyptians as cosmic vandalism. The gods had turned their backs on Egypt, and disasters followed. Military defeats, economic problems, and social unrest all convinced people that Akhenaten had broken the cosmic order. Tutankhamun's restoration stela, erected after Akhenaten's death, explicitly states that the gods had turned their backs on this land. This wasn't just political propaganda, but genuine belief that the previous pharaoh's failures had disrupted the fundamental structure of reality. The young pharaoh had to spend enormous resources and effort convincing people that divine order had been restored. Natural disasters were particularly problematic because they provided immediate, visible evidence of cosmic failure. If a major earthquake struck during a pharaoh's reign, people would immediately question his divine authority. If the Nile failed to flood properly, causing famine, it was seen as proof that the pharaoh had lost the god's support. If plague broke out, it meant the pharaoh had failed to appease angry deities. Personal illness posed especially dangerous challenges. If the pharaoh became visibly sick, it suggested that his divine nature was compromised. Some pharaohs tried to hide illness, but this created other problems. A pharaoh who couldn't perform his religious duties was failing in his cosmic responsibilities. A pharaoh who appeared weak might face challenges from ambitious relatives or officials who claimed they could restore divine favor. Military defeats were almost impossible to explain away because they suggested that the gods had abandoned the pharaoh in battle. Egyptian military ideology claimed that pharaohs were divinely protected and would always triumph over their enemies. When this obviously failed, it created immediate questions about the pharaoh's divine status. Some pharaohs dealt with this by simply lying about military outcomes, but this only worked if the defeats weren't too obvious. The responsibility for cosmic order also meant that pharaohs were expected to have supernatural knowledge and abilities. They were supposed to understand divine will, predict future events, and make decisions that would maintain cosmic balance. When their predictions failed or their decisions led to disasters, it was evidence that they had lost their divine connection. Economic problems were particularly dangerous because they affected everyone's daily life. If trade routes were disrupted, if harvests failed, if inflation made food unaffordable, people would blame the pharaoh's failure to maintain divine favor. Unlike modern leaders who can blame economic problems on external factors, pharaohs were held personally responsible for every aspect of material prosperity. The pressure to prove divine worthiness created a vicious cycle. Pharaohs would invest enormous resources in increasingly elaborate ceremonies and monuments, trying to demonstrate that they still had divine support. But these investments often made economic problems worse, creating more evidence that divine favor was lacking. The more desperately pharaohs tried to prove their divine status, the more obvious their human limitations became. Religious obligations never paused during these crises. Even when facing military invasions, economic collapse, or natural disasters, pharaohs were still expected to perform their daily religious duties. The cosmic maintenance couldn't stop just because human problems were overwhelming. This created impossible situations where pharaohs had to choose between addressing immediate practical crises and maintaining their divine responsibilities. The ultimate nightmare for any pharaoh was a complete breakdown of cosmic order that would be remembered by history as their personal failure. Some pharaohs were so associated with disasters during their reigns that their names were literally erased from official records, as if their very existence had been a cosmic mistake that needed to be corrected. Royal romance in ancient Egypt wasn't about finding your soulmate or falling in love. It was about maintaining divine bloodline purity through marriages that would make modern geneticists cringe. Brother-sister marriages were common to emulate the gods Osiris and Isis, who were siblings and spouses in Egyptian mythology. What the gods did in heaven, pharaohs had to replicate on earth. The documented royal sibling marriages read like a family tree that's actually a family wreath. Senwosret I married his sister Neferu. Amenhotep I married his sister Amos Meritamun. These weren't exceptions or scandals, but standard operating procedure for maintaining what Egyptians believed was the divine purity of royal blood. Cleopatra VII, the most famous Egyptian queen, married both her brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV at different times. This wasn't because she was particularly fond of her siblings, but because Ptolemaic royal law required it. The Ptolemies had been practicing brother-sister marriage for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra came to power. Some pharaohs took this even further with father-daughter marriages. Amenhotep III married his daughter Sitamun. Rameses II married several of his daughters. These marriages weren't about sexual attraction, but about concentrating divine power within the royal bloodline. The closer the family relationship, the more concentrated the divine essence became. The religious justification was ironclad from an Egyptian perspective. If the pharaoh was a living god, then his divine nature had to be preserved through marriage to someone who shared that divine blood. Marrying outside the family would dilute the godly essence and potentially weaken the pharaoh's cosmic authority. It was like a supernatural version of keeping the bloodline pure. Royal marriages were chosen for political and religious reasons, not personal compatibility. The pharaoh's romantic preferences were completely irrelevant. What mattered was maintaining the divine bloodline and ensuring that the next generation would have the cosmic authority necessary to rule Egypt and maintain universal order. The great royal wife held the most important position, but she was often chosen based on her bloodline rather than her personality. She needed to be closely related to the pharaoh to ensure that their children would have the maximum concentration of divine blood. Love was a luxury that divine beings couldn't afford. Secondary wives were also selected for strategic reasons. They might be foreign princesses married for diplomatic purposes, or they might be Egyptian nobles married to cement political alliances. But even these marriages were calculated moves designed to strengthen the pharaoh's power rather than provide emotional fulfillment. The marriage ceremonies themselves were elaborate religious rituals that emphasized the divine nature of the union. These weren't celebrations of romantic love, but cosmic events that maintained the proper order of the universe. The pharaoh and his wife weren't just getting married. They were participating in a sacred drama that had been playing out since the beginning of time. Children from these marriages were raised knowing that their primary value was genetic rather than personal. They were repositories of divine blood whose main purpose was to continue the royal bloodline. Their marriages would be arranged based on the same principles that had governed their parents' unions, perpetuating the cycle of divine inbreeding. The pressure to produce heirs was enormous because the divine bloodline had to continue. If a royal marriage failed to produce children, it was seen as evidence that the gods disapproved of the union. But if it produced too many children, it created succession problems that could destabilize the kingdom. Even reproduction was a cosmic responsibility that had to be managed carefully. Dating was simple for pharaohs. Look around the family dinner table and pick someone. Genetic diversity wasn't on the menu, and romantic compatibility was a concept that didn't exist in the royal vocabulary. Modern science has confirmed what ancient Egyptians probably suspected, but never acknowledged. The divine bloodline preservation strategy was creating genetic disasters that made royal children suffer from birth defects, developmental problems, and shortened lifespans. The gods might have been able to handle sibling marriage, but human biology definitely couldn't. The most famous case study is King Tutankhamun, whose mummy has been analyzed more thoroughly than any other pharaoh. The 2010 DNA study revealed that Tut was the product of brother-sister incest between Akhenaten and his sister. This wasn't speculation or historical gossip, but hard genetic evidence extracted from 3,000-year-old bones. The consequences of this genetic lottery were devastating. Tutankhamun suffered from clubfoot, a congenital deformity that affected his ability to walk normally. Over 130 walking canes were found in his tomb, not as ceremonial objects, but as actual medical equipment that he needed to get around. Imagine being a pharaoh who was supposed to be physically perfect, but couldn't walk without assistance. But the walking problems were just the beginning. Tutankhamun also suffered from bone necrosis, a condition where bone tissue dies due to lack of blood supply. This would have caused constant pain and progressive weakness throughout his short life. He was also infected with malaria, showing that his immune system was compromised and unable to fight off diseases that healthier individuals might survive. The genetic analysis revealed additional problems, including a cleft palate and a curved spine. These weren't minor cosmetic issues, but serious medical conditions that would have affected his breathing, eating, and posture. The boy king was essentially a walking catalog of genetic problems caused by too much family closeness. Most tragically, both of Tutankhamun's daughters were stillborn, likely due to the genetic complications inherited from their parents' incestuous lineage. The royal bloodline that was supposed to ensure divine continuity was actually ensuring genetic extinction. The mummies of these tiny girls were carefully preserved and buried with their father, silent testimony to the human cost of divine bloodline purity. The 18th dynasty pharaohs, to which Tutankhamun belonged, may have suffered from familial temporal epilepsy, a genetic condition that causes seizures and can be passed down through families with high rates of inbreeding. This would explain some of the unusual artistic depictions of pharaohs from this period, which might have been attempts to portray the physical effects of neurological disorders. Akhenaten's unusual artistic depictions, showing him with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and unusual body proportions, were probably not artistic choices, but realistic portrayals of genetic consequences. What historians once thought was revolutionary art was actually documentary evidence of what happens when royal families become too genetically isolated. The 2015 study of body height among Egyptian pharaohs provided additional evidence of inbreeding problems. Height is a highly heritable trait, and populations with high levels of inbreeding typically show less variation in physical characteristics. The study found exactly this pattern among royal mummies, confirming that genetic diversity was indeed limited within royal families. Recent analysis of 259 Egyptian mummies showed consistent patterns of health problems among royal individuals compared to common people. The pharaohs, who were supposed to be physically superior to their subjects, were actually suffering from more genetic disorders and shorter lifespans than the people they ruled. The irony is devastating. The very strategy that was supposed to preserve divine perfection was creating human disasters. The royal bloodline that was meant to ensure cosmic order was actually ensuring genetic chaos. Every generation of inbreeding made the problems worse, creating a downward spiral of genetic deterioration disguised as divine purity. Modern medical analysis suggests that if the Egyptian royal families had continued their inbreeding practices, they would eventually have become extinct due to accumulating genetic problems. The divine bloodline preservation strategy was actually a divine bloodline destruction strategy that worked slowly enough that each generation could ignore the long-term consequences. Having multiple wives might sound like a pharaoh's dream, but the reality was more like a nightmare of competing interests, jealous rivalries, and constant political maneuvering. The royal harem wasn't a pleasure palace, but a political war zone where women fought for their children's survival and their own security. Every meal, every conversation, every intimate moment was potentially part of a larger power struggle. The hierarchy within the harem was complex and constantly shifting. The great royal wife held the top position, but her security depended on producing male heirs and maintaining the pharaoh's favor. Secondary wives were always looking for opportunities to advance their own children's prospects, sometimes by eliminating the competition through poison, conspiracy, or political maneuvering. Royal women competed for the pharaoh's attention using every weapon at their disposal. Beauty, intelligence, political connections, and religious authority were all fair game in the struggle for influence. But the ultimate prize wasn't romantic love, but having your son chosen as the next pharaoh. Everything else was secondary to this fundamental goal. The economics of maintaining hundreds of royal women was staggering. Each wife needed her own household, servants, clothing, jewelry, and entertainment. The cost of supporting the royal harem was one of the largest expenses in the kingdom's budget. But cutting costs meant losing face, and losing face meant losing political support from the noble families whose daughters had married into the royal family. Royal children growing up in this environment learned early that family relationships were political calculations. Your half-siblings weren't playmates, but potential threats to your inheritance. Your mother's co-wives weren't additional maternal figures, but enemies who might try to eliminate you to advance their own children's interests. the succession implications were constantly present. Every royal pregnancy was a potential game changer that could affect the political balance within the harem. If a secondary wife gave birth to a son while the great royal wife had only daughters, the power dynamics would shift dramatically. These births weren't just personal events, but political crises that required careful management. Palace intrigue reached levels that would make modern soap operas look tame. Wives would form alliances against other wives, then betray their allies when circumstances changed. They would use their children as pawns in political games, arranging marriages and adoptions to strengthen their positions. They would curry favor with palace officials, priests, and military commanders to build power bases outside the harem. The most dangerous rivalries were between women whose children had legitimate claims to the throne. These weren't just personal disputes, but existential struggles where the stakes were life and death. The losing side in a succession dispute could face exile, imprisonment, or execution. The winning side would become the most powerful people in the kingdom. Murder was always a possibility within the harem. Poison was the preferred method because it was difficult to detect and could be disguised as illness or accident. The harem conspiracy that killed Ramesses III shows how far royal women were willing to go to advance their political goals. The psychological toll on royal children was enormous. They grew up knowing that their mothers might be plotting against their father, that their half-siblings might be trying to kill them, and that their own survival depended on their ability to navigate deadly political currents. Royal family gatherings were exercises in carefully controlled tension. Everyone had to maintain the appearance of family harmony, while knowing that beneath the surface, multiple conspiracies were probably being planned. Dinner conversations were minefields where a single wrong word could trigger political consequences that lasted for generations. The harem system created a feedback loop of political instability. The more wives a pharaoh had, the more potential succession disputes he created. The more succession disputes he created, the more dangerous palace life became. The more dangerous palace life became, the more paranoid and isolated the pharaoh became. It's like a corporate office where every department head is married to the CEO. They're all trying to get their kids promoted to executive positions. And office politics can literally turn deadly. Except this lasted for thousands of years. And they were running an entire civilization while scheming against each other. Being pharaoh meant you couldn't just give orders from a safe palace and let your generals handle the dangerous work. You were expected to personally command armies in battle, leading from the front like a divine warrior who could inspire troops and guarantee victory through your very presence. Military defeats weren't just political failures, but cosmic disasters that proved you'd lost divine favor and legitimacy. The pressure was immense because Egyptian military ideology claimed that pharaohs were divinely protected and would always triumph over their enemies. When this obviously failed, it created immediate questions about the pharaoh's divine status. There was no room for excuses, strategic retreats, or learning from mistakes. You either won decisively or faced the possibility that your divine authority was compromised. Thutmose III conducted extensive military campaigns to maintain Egypt's empire, personally leading 17 military expeditions into Syria and Palestine. He wasn't doing this for fun or glory, but because the empire's survival depended on constant military pressure against enemies who would interpret any sign of weakness as an invitation to rebel. Every season brought new military obligations that required royal leadership. The constant external threats were relentless. The Hittites controlled much of modern-day Turkey and Syria, representing a sophisticated military power that could match Egyptian resources. The Nubians to the south controlled gold mines that Egypt desperately needed. The Libyans to the west launched regular raids that required military responses. The mysterious sea peoples invaded from the Mediterranean, destroying entire civilizations. The Battle of Kadesh, fought between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli, shows the massive scale of military commitments required. Ramesses brought an army of 20,000 soldiers, hundreds of chariots, and extensive supply trains on a campaign that lasted months. The pharaoh personally led the charge, risking his life in hand-to-hand combat while trying to maintain his image of divine invincibility. Ramesses III's defense against the Sea Peoples required personal leadership in what was essentially a fight for civilization's survival. These weren't local disputes or border skirmishes, but existential threats that could destroy Egyptian civilization entirely. The pharaoh couldn't delegate this responsibility to subordinates, because failure would mean the end of everything he was supposed to protect. The psychological pressure was enormous. Modern presidents can delegate military command to professional generals and take credit for victories while avoiding personal blame for defeats. Ancient pharaohs had no such luxury. Every military outcome was a direct reflection of their divine status and personal competence as warrior kings. Military campaigns also required pharaohs to demonstrate physical courage in ways that would terrify modern leaders. They had to charge into battle on horse-drawn chariots, wielding bronze weapons while arrows flew around them. They had to maintain their divine composure while watching soldiers die, making life-and-death decisions under extreme stress, and personally killing enemies in hand-to-hand combat. The logistics of royal military campaigns were staggering. The pharaoh had to bring not just his army but his entire royal household, including priests to perform daily religious ceremonies, craftsmen to maintain equipment, and administrators to handle the kingdom's business while he was away. It was like moving a small city across hostile territory while fighting wars. Religious obligations continued even during military campaigns. The pharaoh still had to perform his daily rituals to maintain cosmic order, even while planning battles and managing armies. If he failed in his religious duties, it could be interpreted as the reason for military setbacks. If he focused too much on religion and neglected military planning, he could lose battles that would undermine his divine authority. The economic costs of constant military leadership were enormous. Royal military campaigns consumed vast resources that could have been used for other purposes. But pharaohs had no choice because military weakness would invite invasions that could destroy the kingdom entirely. It was an expensive form of insurance that had to be paid constantly. Imagine if every president had to personally lead troops into battle, and losing a single fight meant losing the divine right to rule. No delegating, no strategic retreats, just you, a bronze sword, and your reputation as a living god on the line every time enemies threatened the kingdom. Chariot warfare, the primary mode of ancient combat, was essentially extreme sports with lethal consequences. Pharaohs had to master high-speed maneuvering while shooting arrows, throwing spears, and avoiding enemy projectiles. These weren't ceremonial rides for show, but genuine combat situations, where a single mistake could mean death or capture that would end the dynasty. The chariots themselves were remarkable pieces of technology, but incredibly dangerous to operate. They were lightweight vehicles designed for speed and maneuverability, which meant they offered virtually no protection for their occupants. The pharaoh stood exposed on a platform moving at high speed across rough terrain, trying to maintain his balance while engaging in combat. Battle wounds had to be hidden to maintain the divine image of invincibility. If the pharaoh was injured, it suggested that his divine protection had failed, which could trigger political crises. Royal physicians became experts at treating wounds in ways that wouldn't be visible to the public, and elaborate makeup and clothing techniques were used to hide battle scars. The bronze weapons and armor of the period were incredibly heavy, especially in the extreme heat of Egyptian and Middle Eastern climates. A full set of royal battle gear could weigh over 50 pounds, and wearing it during extended combat in desert conditions would have been physically exhausting. The pharaoh had to maintain his fighting effectiveness while dealing with dehydration, heat exhaustion, and physical fatigue. Single mistakes in preparing for campaigns could mean disaster for entire families. If the pharaoh was killed or captured, his wives and children would face execution, exile, or slavery at the hands of enemies. The personal stakes were always life and death, not just for the pharaoh, but for everyone he cared about. The risk of death or capture that could end entire dynasties was constant. Enemy kings understood that capturing or killing the pharaoh would destroy Egyptian resistance and allow them to claim divine authority for themselves. This made the pharaoh the primary target in every battle, with enemy forces specifically trying to eliminate him while his own troops desperately tried to protect him. No option existed to retreat or show cowardice without losing divine authority completely. Egyptian ideology claimed that pharaohs were divinely protected and would always triumph over their enemies. Any sign of fear, hesitation, or strategic withdrawal could be interpreted as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their support. Expected to fight in personal combat despite physical limitations that would make such fighting extremely dangerous. Not all pharaohs were young, strong, or healthy enough for intensive combat, but the role required them to participate anyway. Older pharaohs, sick pharaohs, and physically disabled pharaohs still had to maintain the image of warrior kings. The weapons technology of the period meant that even minor wounds could become life-threatening due to infection. Bronze weapons were extremely sharp, but also prone to breaking, creating jagged edges that caused terrible wounds. Medical knowledge was limited, and battlefield conditions made proper treatment nearly impossible. Battle conditions were chaotic and unpredictable in ways that made royal participation extremely risky. Dust clouds from charging armies made visibility poor. The noise of combat made communication difficult. Horses and chariots created additional hazards beyond enemy weapons. Even experienced warriors could be killed by accidents that had nothing to do with enemy action. Royal participation in combat also created tactical problems for Egyptian armies. Protecting the pharaoh became a priority that could interfere with optimal military strategy. Troops had to be diverted from offensive operations to guard duty. Battle plans had to be modified to minimize risks to the royal person, which might not be the most effective approach for winning battles. Building and maintaining armies capable of protecting Egypt's vast empire required enormous financial resources that consumed a significant portion of the kingdom's wealth. The military budget wasn't just about weapons and soldiers, but included extensive infrastructure, supply chains, and technological development that represented ongoing economic commitments. Parameses, the capital city built by Rameses II, included massive bronze-working factories that show the scale of military industrial production required. These facilities employed thousands of workers and consumed vast quantities of raw materials, all dedicated to producing weapons, armor, and equipment for the royal armies. Maintaining border fortifications and garrison towns across the empire required constant investment in construction, supplies, and personnel. Egypt's borders stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, requiring defensive installations that could resist enemy attacks and serve as bases for offensive operations. Supporting long-distance campaigns while maintaining domestic economy created enormous logistical challenges. Armies had to be fed, equipped, and paid while operating hundreds of miles from Egypt. Supply lines had to be protected and maintained across hostile territory. The economic disruption of removing large numbers of workers from agricultural and craft production affected the entire kingdom. Military failures could bankrupt the kingdom and trigger internal rebellions that would be even more dangerous than external enemies. If expensive military campaigns failed to achieve their objectives, the wasted resources could create economic crises that undermined domestic stability. Failed wars often led to higher taxes, reduced services, and social unrest. Success was required to maintain tribute income from conquered territories that helped offset the costs of military operations. Egypt's empire was essentially a protection racket, where conquered peoples paid tribute in exchange for security. If military failures allowed tribute-paying territories to rebel or be conquered by enemies, Egypt would lose income while facing increased military expenses. Competition with temple complexes for economic resources created internal political problems. The temples controlled enormous wealth and land holdings that could theoretically be used for military purposes, but redirecting religious resources for warfare risked creating conflicts with powerful priests who had their own political agendas. Trade disruptions during conflicts affected the royal treasury by reducing customs revenues and commercial activity. Military campaigns often closed trade routes or made them too dangerous for normal commercial activity. The economic effects of warfare extended far beyond direct military costs to include lost opportunities and reduced economic growth. The military-industrial complex required for effective warfare consumed resources that could have been used for other purposes. Egypt's bronze-working facilities, chariot manufacturing, weapons production, and military training all represented economic activities that produced no civilian benefits while requiring constant investment. Modern defense contractors at least produce technologies that sometimes have civilian applications. Ancient military production was purely destructive, creating weapons and equipment that served no purpose except warfare, while consuming materials and labor that could have improved people's lives in peacetime. It's like being CEO of a defense contractor, general of the army, and head of the Treasury Department all at once. Except if you lose one contract, the gods themselves fire you along with everyone you've ever cared about. Imagine being the CEO of a company with millions of employees, except every single decision, no matter how small, has to be approved by you personally. Every employee grievance needs your signature. Every budget request requires divine intervention. Every personnel dispute demands your personal judgment. Now imagine that this company spans an entire civilization, and if you make the wrong decision, the gods themselves might fire you. That was the daily reality of being Pharaoh. The Pharaoh held final authority on everything from major military campaigns to minor property disputes between farmers. Criminal punishments couldn't be decided by local courts or regional officials. Only the Pharaoh could sentence someone to death, imprisonment, or exile. This wasn't about maintaining control, but about cosmic responsibility. As the living representative of divine justice, every legal decision had to flow through his personal judgment to ensure it aligned with Maat. Picture the logistics of this system. Reports from 42 different nomes or provinces required personal review and royal decisions. Each nome had its own administrators, but they couldn't make significant choices without pharaoh approval. A local official might know exactly what needed to be done to solve a problem, but they had to wait for word from the royal palace before acting. The delays must have been maddening for everyone involved. House allocations for workers required the pharaoh's direct approval. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in ancient Egypt, a family was waiting to know where they could live, and that decision had to work its way up through layers of bureaucracy until it reached the most powerful person in the known world. The pharaoh had to consider housing assignments between his divine duties and military planning. Diplomatic correspondence demanded immediate royal responses because foreign kingdoms expected to deal directly with the pharaoh, not his representatives. When the king of Babylon sent a letter, he wasn't writing to Egypt's foreign minister. He was writing to a living god who was personally responsible for maintaining international relationships that could determine whether there would be war or peace. Construction projects needed constant oversight and resource decisions that only the pharaoh could authorize. Every pyramid, temple, and palace required materials, workers, and funding that had to be allocated through royal decree. The pharaoh couldn't just approve a construction budget and walk away. He had to monitor progress, resolve disputes, and make adjustments as projects developed complications. Modern presidents delegate authority to cabinet members, department heads, and regional administrators who can make decisions within their areas of expertise. Ancient pharaohs faced a terrible dilemma. Giving officials too much authority created potential rivals who might build independent power bases and challenge royal authority. But trying to handle every decision personally made effective governance nearly impossible. The sheer volume of decisions requiring royal attention would have been overwhelming even for someone with superhuman administrative abilities. Tax collection disputes, trade negotiations, military appointments, religious ceremony scheduling, resource allocation, infrastructure maintenance, and legal disputes all needed pharaoh input. There weren't enough hours in the day to handle everything properly. The psychological toll of this administrative burden was enormous. Modern executives can take sick days, delegate during vacations, and rely on teams of specialists to handle complex decisions. The pharaoh had no such luxury. Every day brought new decisions that couldn't wait, couldn't be delegated, and couldn't be handled incorrectly without risking divine displeasure. Even routine administrative tasks became exercises in cosmic responsibility. Approving trade routes wasn't just about commerce, but about maintaining relationships with foreign powers that could affect Egypt's security. Managing grain storage wasn't just about logistics, but about ensuring the kingdom could survive famines that might be tests from the gods. The pharaoh was essentially running the world's first multinational corporation, except instead of shareholders to answer to, he had angry gods who would destroy civilization if he made too many mistakes. Every administrative decision carried the weight of cosmic responsibility, and there was no possibility of retirement, vacation time, or delegating ultimate accountability to someone else. Wake up before dawn for purification rituals. Perform religious ceremonies until mid-morning. Review reports from 42 provinces. Handle criminal cases that only you can judge. Manage diplomatic correspondence with foreign kingdoms. Oversee construction projects. Plan military campaigns. Balance the royal budget. Make trade decisions. Resolve noble family disputes, all before lunch. Then repeat for the afternoon and evening every single day until you die. The pharaoh's schedule would make modern workaholics weep with exhaustion. Unlike presidents who can delegate responsibilities to specialized departments, Pharaohs had to personally balance religious ceremonies, military planning, and administrative duties with no separation between church and state. No cabinet to share the burden, and no vacation days. Managing complex relationships with powerful priests and regional governors required constant diplomatic skill. These weren't just employees who could be fired at will. They were influential power brokers with their own constituencies, resources, and political agendas. The pharaoh had to keep them loyal without giving them enough independence to become threats. Temple priests controlled enormous wealth and land holdings, sometimes rivaling royal resources. Regional governors commanded local militias and knew their territories better than the pharaoh ever could. Personal audiences where officials presented problems requiring immediate solutions could consume entire days. Unlike modern executives who schedule meetings and limit discussion time, the pharaoh was expected to give each petitioner the time and attention their problems deserved. Rushing through these audiences could offend powerful people whose support was essential for maintaining control. A single audience might involve settling boundary disputes between nobles, authorizing emergency grain distributions, or deciding whether to execute someone for treason. Overseeing tax collection systems across the entire kingdom meant understanding local economic conditions, crop yields, trade patterns, and population changes in dozens of different regions. The pharaoh couldn't just set tax rates and forget about them. He had to monitor collection results, adjust policies based on changing conditions, and personally authorize exceptions for communities facing hardships. When the Nile flooded poorly, entire provinces might need tax relief. When trade routes were disrupted by warfare, commercial taxes had to be recalculated. Diplomatic negotiations requiring the pharaoh's personal involvement could last for months. Foreign rulers expected to deal directly with Egypt's divine king, not his representatives. These negotiations often involved complex treaties covering trade rights, military alliances, marriage arrangements, and territorial boundaries. The pharaoh had to understand not just Egypt's interests, but the political situations in other kingdoms. A single diplomatic miscalculation could trigger wars that would consume the kingdom's resources for decades. The paperwork alone would have been overwhelming. Every decision had to be documented, every order had to be recorded, every treaty had to be copied and stored. Ancient Egyptian bureaucracy was legendary for its thoroughness, but this meant the pharaoh was drowning in administrative documents that required his personal review and approval. Modern CEOs can take weekends off, delegate during vacations, and rely on teams of specialists. The pharaoh had no concept of delegating ultimate responsibility or taking time off from being a living god. His divine duties never paused, his administrative responsibilities never decreased, and his military obligations never waited for his convenience. Even illness couldn't excuse him from his cosmic responsibilities. The multitasking required was literally superhuman. While planning military campaigns, the pharaoh also had to ensure religious festivals proceeded on schedule. While handling diplomatic crises, he had to make decisions about domestic infrastructure projects. While dealing with natural disasters, he had to maintain the complex ceremonial activities that kept the gods happy and the cosmos in order. It's like being forced to run a Fortune 500 company while simultaneously serving as head chaplain and four-star general, with no possibility of taking sick leave. The pharaoh faced an impossible administrative dilemma. Effective governance required delegation, but delegation created threats to royal authority. Every time he gave someone enough power to actually help run the kingdom, he potentially created a rival who could use that same power against him. It was like being forced to arm your enemies, knowing that the crushing workload could destroy you faster than any assassin ever could. Giving officials too much authority created potential rivals who could build independent power bases and challenge royal control. Viziers, in particular, wielded enormous power as chief administrators. They controlled access to the pharaoh, managed daily government operations, and had detailed knowledge of the kingdom's resources and weaknesses. A corrupt or ambitious vizier could easily organize a coup from within the system. The office of vizier was so powerful that some historians believe certain viziers effectively ruled Egypt, while pharaohs became figureheads. Regional governors might become rebellious if given too much autonomy to handle local problems effectively. They commanded local resources, knew the terrain, and had relationships with local power brokers. If a governor decided to declare independence, he would have everything needed to resist royal authority. But without sufficient autonomy, governors couldn't handle the regional problems that required immediate attention. The 42 nomes of Egypt each had their own economic conditions, local traditions, and potential threats that required specialized knowledge to manage effectively. Delegating religious duties could undermine claims to divine authority that were essential for legitimacy. If priests could perform the most important ceremonies without royal participation, people might question whether the pharaoh was really necessary for maintaining cosmic order. But the pharaoh couldn't personally conduct every religious ceremony in every temple across the kingdom. The temple system was vast, with major religious complexes in Memphis, Thebes, Heliopolis, and dozens of smaller cities, each requiring regular ceremonies to maintain divine favor. Popular officials could become alternative centers of loyalty that threatened royal supremacy. If a military commander, administrator, or priest became too beloved by the people, they might attract supporters who preferred their leadership to the pharaohs. The most competent officials were often the most dangerous, because their success made them attractive alternatives to royal rule. History shows several cases where successful generals or administrators accumulated enough popular support to challenge pharaonic authority directly. Constant balancing was required between effective administration and power protection. The pharaoh had to give officials enough authority to do their jobs, but not enough to threaten his position. This meant constantly monitoring subordinates, limiting their resources, and preventing them from building networks that could operate independently. Intelligence networks had to watch the watchers, creating layers of surveillance that consumed enormous resources while breeding paranoia throughout the administration. The security implications were staggering. Every administrative decision had to be evaluated not just for its effectiveness, but for its impact on royal security. Efficient policies that strengthened local administrators might weaken central control. Centralized policies that protected royal authority might make governance less effective. The pharaoh had to choose between having a well-run kingdom and having a secure throne, knowing that either choice carried serious risks. Temple priests represented a particular challenge because they controlled vast wealth and claimed direct relationships with the gods. Some priestly families had served in temples for generations, accumulating knowledge, resources, and influence that could rival royal power. The pharaoh needed their support to maintain religious legitimacy, but had to prevent them from becoming independent power centers. Modern democratic systems solve this problem through constitutional limits, term limits, and institutional checks and balances. Ancient Egypt had no such safeguards. The pharaoh had to personally manage every aspect of power sharing while maintaining absolute authority. Keep too much control, and the administrative burden would crush you. Share too generously, and those same officials might use that power to destroy you. Being a living god comes with certain expectations. You're supposed to be physically perfect, divinely protected from illness, and immune to the diseases that afflict ordinary mortals. Unfortunately, human biology doesn't care about your divine status, and Egyptian pharaohs suffered from the same diseases as everyone else. The difference was that they had to hide their suffering while maintaining the illusion of supernatural health. Imagine having to give a State of the Union address while suffering from food poisoning, knowing that if anyone notices you're sick, they'll assume God has abandoned the country. That was essentially what pharaohs faced every time illness struck. Visible sickness could be interpreted as loss of divine favor, triggering political upheaval that could destroy dynasties. Tutankhamun's multiple health problems reveal the medical reality behind the divine facade. The 2010 DNA study showed he suffered from clubfoot, a congenital deformity that affected his ability to walk normally. Over 130 walking canes were found in his tomb, not as ceremonial objects, but as actual medical equipment he needed for mobility. The boy king, who was supposed to be physically perfect, couldn't walk without assistance. But Tutankhamun's problems went far beyond mobility issues. He also suffered from bone necrosis, a condition where bone tissue dies due to lack of blood supply. This would have caused constant pain and progressive weakness throughout his short life. He was infected with malaria, showing that his immune system was compromised and unable to fight off diseases that healthier individuals might survive. Additional problems included a cleft palate and curved spine that would have affected his breathing, eating, and posture. Ramesses vs. mummy shows clear smallpox scars from an infection that must have been visible during his lifetime. Imagine being a pharaoh covered in disfiguring poxmarks while trying to maintain the image of divine perfection. The royal physicians would have had to use elaborate makeup and clothing techniques to hide the visible evidence of disease during public appearances. The medical treatments available to pharaohs were often more torture than cure. Ancient Egyptian medicine involved painful procedures with minimal effectiveness. Treatments included drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits, cauterizing wounds with hot irons, and administering medicines that were often more poisonous than the diseases they were meant to treat. Being royal meant getting the most aggressive treatments, not necessarily the most effective ones. Disease outbreaks during Amenhotep III's reign required hidden management to prevent panic and political instability. If the pharaoh became visibly ill during an epidemic, people might interpret it as evidence that he had lost the god's protection and could no longer shield his people from divine punishment. Royal illness had to be concealed even when it made governing nearly impossible. Physical disabilities had to be accommodated without appearing weak or compromised. Palace protocols were designed to hide royal limitations while maintaining the appearance of divine strength. Special chairs, walking aids, and mobility assistants were disguised as ceremonial objects. Court ceremonies were choreographed to minimize physical demands on pharaohs who might be struggling with chronic conditions. The psychological pressure of maintaining divine health standards while dealing with very human medical problems must have been overwhelming. Modern leaders can take sick days, seek medical treatment publicly, and acknowledge their human limitations. Pharaohs had to suffer in silence, while performing the demanding physical and mental tasks required for governing an empire and maintaining cosmic order. The cruel irony of being a living god was that you had to appear invincible while being utterly human. Every cough, every limp, every sign of fatigue could be interpreted as evidence that your divine nature was compromised. The pressure to maintain perfect health wasn't just personal vanity but political necessity, because visible illness could trigger succession crises and civil wars. Visible illness could be interpreted as loss of divine favor by both the royal court and the general population. If the pharaoh appeared weak or sick during public ceremonies, people might assume the gods had withdrawn their support. This could embolden political rivals, encourage rebellions in distant provinces, and undermine the entire religious foundation of Egyptian society. A pharaoh with a visible limp wasn't just disabled, he was cosmically compromised. The pharaoh had to maintain public appearances and ceremonies even when seriously sick, creating impossible physical demands during medical crises. Religious festivals couldn't be postponed because the pharaoh had a fever. Military campaigns couldn't be delayed because the royal commander was suffering from chronic pain. Diplomatic meetings couldn't be rescheduled because the divine king was too weak to stand for extended periods. Palace physicians were practicing experimental treatments on the most important patient in the kingdom, often with disastrous results. Royal medicine meant getting the most aggressive treatments available, regardless of their safety or effectiveness. Pharaohs were subjected to dangerous procedures, toxic medications, and painful interventions that were justified by their supposed divine nature. If normal medicine wasn't working, royal physicians would try increasingly desperate measures. Limited pain management options in ancient Egyptian medicine meant that pharaohs had to endure chronic conditions while maintaining their divine composure. There were no effective anesthetics, no surgical pain relief, and no treatments for the kind of genetic disorders that plagued royal families. A pharaoh suffering from bone necrosis had to smile through excruciating pain while performing religious ceremonies that required hours of standing and ritual movement. Fear that obvious health problems would trigger succession disputes created additional stress that probably made medical conditions worse. If courtiers suspected the pharaoh was dying, they might begin positioning themselves for the transition of power. Ambitious relatives could interpret royal illness as an opportunity to advance their own claims to the throne. The pharaoh had to appear healthy not just for religious reasons, but to prevent civil wars. Medical crises had to be managed while maintaining the godly image, requiring elaborate deceptions that consumed vast resources. Royal makeup artists, costume designers, and protocol specialists worked to hide evidence of illness. Special ceremonies were designed to minimize physical demands on sick pharaohs. Body doubles might be used for distant public appearances where the deception could be maintained. The medical knowledge available to royal physicians was often worse than useless, combining superstition with dangerous procedures that could kill patients they were trying to help. Treatments included bloodletting that weakened already sick pharaohs, toxic medications that caused additional health problems, and surgical procedures performed without proper sanitation or anesthesia. Being royal meant access to the most sophisticated medical care available, which was often sophisticated torture. Palace medical crises became state secrets that required extensive cover-ups involving dozens of people. Servants, physicians, family members, and court officials all had to maintain the fiction of royal health while knowing the pharaoh was suffering or dying. These conspiracies of silence created additional security risks, because anyone who knew the truth about royal health became a potential threat to political stability. Even dying had to be choreographed as political and religious theater, because how a pharaoh died would affect the kingdom's stability and the new ruler's legitimacy. Death couldn't be a private medical event, but had to be managed as a cosmic transition that maintained divine authority while transferring power smoothly to the designated successor. Succession planning was complicated by the need to maintain divine authority until the moment of death, creating impossible balancing acts between preparing for transition and appearing eternally vigorous. If the pharaoh designated an heir too early, it might signal that he expected to die soon, which could trigger immediate political crises. If he waited too long, his actual death might catch the kingdom unprepared for orderly succession. The mummification process was designed to preserve royal status for eternity, requiring elaborate preparations that began during the pharaoh's lifetime. Royal embalmers had to be trained in special techniques that would ensure the pharaoh's body remained suitable for godly habitation in the afterlife. The process took 70 days and involved removing organs, treating the body with natron salts, and wrapping it in linen bandages treated with resins and oils. Tomb construction projects consumed massive resources throughout the pharaoh's lifetime, representing ongoing reminders of mortality that contradicted claims of eternal immortality. Building a proper royal tomb could take decades and employ thousands of workers. The Great Pyramid required an estimated 20,000 workers laboring for over 20 years. The pharaoh had to constantly make decisions about his own burial, while trying to maintain the illusion that he would live forever as a godly being. The selection and preparation of burial goods became a major preoccupation that revealed the extent to which death planning dominated royal life. Pharaohs needed everything they might require in the afterlife, including furniture, weapons, jewelry, food, and even boats for celestial navigation. Tutankhamun's tomb contained over 5,000 individual objects, and his tomb was considered modest by royal standards. Fear of being judged inadequate in the afterlife created additional anxiety during an already stressful existence. Egyptian religious beliefs required pharaohs to account for their earthly performance during divine judgment after death. The pharaoh's heart would be weighed against the feather of Mad, and if found wanting, his soul would be devoured by the monster Ammit. A pharaoh who had failed in his cosmic responsibilities might face eternal punishment. Concern about tomb security and preservation of eternal divine status led to elaborate precautions that often attracted the very tomb robbers they were meant to deter. Hidden entrances, false chambers, and curse inscriptions were designed to protect royal burials. But the more elaborate the security measures, the more obvious it became that valuable treasures were hidden inside. Most royal tombs were robbed within decades of construction, meaning pharaohs spent fortunes on eternal security that rarely worked. The pharaoh's death had to appear as a divine transition rather than medical failure, requiring careful management of the circumstances and timing of royal death announcements. Palace officials had to ensure that news of the pharaoh's death was presented in ways that reinforced rather than undermined the divine nature of kingship. Medical personnel who witnessed the pharaoh's final illness became security risks who might reveal embarrassing details about royal mortality. Death became one final performance in a lifetime of religious theater, but it was a performance the pharaoh couldn't personally oversee. Picture your personal expenses, including building several skyscrapers, maintaining a private army, and throwing citywide parties every few months, all while ensuring the gods don't get angry at your budget choices. That was essentially the financial reality of being pharaoh. Looking divine wasn't just about having nice clothes and jewelry. It required a level of spending that would make modern billionaires weep at their accountants' reports. The vast expense of royal regalia, ceremonial items, and palace maintenance consumed a staggering portion of Egypt's wealth. A single pharaoh's crown might contain enough gold to fund a small army for a year. The ceremonial scepters, jewelry, and clothing needed for religious ceremonies weren't just expensive accessories, but essential tools for maintaining cosmic order. Every piece had to be perfect, because imperfect regalia could signal divine displeasure. Supporting hundreds of royal family members and palace dependents created ongoing financial obligations that never decreased. The royal household wasn't just the pharaoh and his immediate family, but extended to include distant relatives, multiple wives, dozens of children, personal servants, bodyguards, priests, administrators, and craftsmen. Each person required housing, food, clothing, and salaries. The palace was essentially a small city that had to be funded entirely from royal resources. Elaborate festivals and public ceremonies were required to demonstrate divine favor, but these celebrations could cost more than building entire temples. The Apet festival alone lasted 27 days and required massive expenditures on food, decorations, entertainment, and gifts for participants. Thousands of people had to be fed, housed, and entertained at royal expense. Skipping or reducing these celebrations could be interpreted as evidence that the pharaoh was losing divine support. Monument building was necessary to prove divine blessing and legitimacy, but the costs were astronomical. The Great Pyramid required an estimated 20,000 workers laboring for over 20 years, consuming resources equivalent to Egypt's entire economic output for extended periods. Every pharaoh was expected to build monuments that would demonstrate his divine favor, while providing employment for thousands of workers and craftsmen. Importing exotic materials and goods from across the known world was essential for maintaining royal prestige, but required extensive trade networks and diplomatic relationships. Royal furniture made from Lebanese cedar, jewelry crafted from Nubian gold, spices from distant lands, and precious stones from remote quarries all had to be acquired regardless of cost. The pharaoh's possessions had to reflect his cosmic status. Artistic and architectural projects served as evidence of continued divine support, but they represented ongoing financial commitments that could last for decades. Royal workshops employed hundreds of skilled craftsmen who specialized in creating objects that met divine standards. These workshops had to be maintained year-round, not just during active construction projects, because the skills required couldn't be quickly recreated when needed. The economic pressure was relentless because divine status required constant demonstration through visible wealth and generosity. Unlike modern wealthy individuals who can choose when and how to display their resources, pharaohs had to maintain maximum luxury at all times. Any reduction in royal spending could be interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure or economic weakness that might encourage rebellions or foreign invasions. Palace security alone required enormous resources because protecting a living god demanded more extensive precautions than safeguarding ordinary rulers. The royal guard had to be larger, better equipped, and more thoroughly trained than any other military force. Palace fortifications had to be constantly maintained and upgraded. Intelligence networks had to monitor potential threats throughout the kingdom and beyond. The pharaoh faced an impossible economic equation. Divine status required unlimited spending to demonstrate cosmic favor, but the kingdom's resources were definitely limited. It was like being expected to maintain a billionaire lifestyle while running a small country's economy. Accept your budget decisions could literally determine whether the gods continued supporting your civilization. Tax collection was limited by what people could bear without rebellion, creating a ceiling on royal income that divine expectations refused to acknowledge. Push taxes too high, and productive farmers would abandon their fields or join rebellions. Set taxes too low, and there wouldn't be enough revenue to fund the divine lifestyle that legitimized royal authority. The pharaoh had to extract maximum resources without destroying the economic base that generated those resources. Regional tax collection required constant monitoring because local officials might skim revenues or falsify reports about local conditions. Natural disasters reduced income while increasing the need for royal relief efforts, creating devastating budget shortfalls during the times when royal generosity was most essential. When the Nile flooded poorly, crop yields would plummet, reducing tax revenues just when people needed emergency food assistance. The pharaoh was expected to open royal granaries and provide relief, spending heavily during exactly the periods when income was lowest. Multi-year droughts could exhaust the royal treasury while creating social unrest that required expensive military responses. Competition with powerful temple complexes for economic resources created ongoing political and financial tensions that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Major temples controlled vast land holdings, employed thousands of workers, and demanded constant donations to maintain divine favor. The pharaoh couldn't simply redirect temple resources for royal use without risking religious rebellion. But he also couldn't allow temples to become wealthier and more powerful than the royal household. Some temple complexes accumulated enough wealth to challenge royal authority directly. Trade disruptions during conflicts affected the royal treasury by reducing customs revenues and commercial activity that funded royal lifestyle requirements. Military campaigns that were necessary for maintaining royal prestige often closed profitable trade routes or made them too dangerous for normal commerce. The pharaoh had to spend heavily on warfare while losing the income that military success was supposed to protect. International conflicts could disrupt trade relationships that had taken decades to establish. Managing national food storage and distribution during famines meant substantial royal expenditures that could exhaust the treasury during multi-year crises. Egypt's agricultural system depended on predictable Nile floods, but climate variations could create extended periods of scarcity. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining enough food reserves to feed the entire population during lean years, a financial burden that could consume decades of accumulated wealth. Storage facilities had to be built and maintained across the kingdom, demanding ongoing investment in infrastructure that produced no immediate revenue. Economic failures were interpreted as signs of lost divine favor, creating political crises that made financial recovery even more difficult. If royal spending had to be reduced due to budget constraints, people might interpret this as evidence that the gods were withdrawing their support. This could encourage rebellions, foreign invasions, or succession disputes that would require even more spending to resolve. Financial problems became self-perpetuating cycles that could destroy entire dynasties. The pharaoh had no modern economic tools like deficit spending, international loans, or currency manipulation to manage financial crises. When royal expenses exceeded income, the only options were raising taxes, reducing spending, or confiscating wealth from wealthy families. All of these solutions created political problems that could threaten royal survival, making economic management a constant exercise in choosing between different types of disaster. Royal accounting systems were primitive compared to modern financial management, making it difficult to track expenses or plan budgets effectively. Scribes maintained records of income and expenditures, but without standardized accounting principles or financial forecasting tools, pharaohs often discovered they were bankrupt only after running out of money. The lack of financial planning meant that expensive projects might be started without adequate funding to complete them. creating half-finished monuments that represented total losses of invested resources. Royal gift-giving to temples and officials was required to maintain loyalty. But these obligations accumulated over time until they consumed enormous portions of the royal budget. Every appointment, every favor, every political alliance had to be cemented with valuable gifts that demonstrated royal generosity. Officials expected regular bonuses, temples demanded constant donations, and foreign diplomats required expensive presents that reflected Egypt's wealth and power. Diplomatic relations required expensive exchanges with foreign rulers that could cost more than military campaigns while producing uncertain benefits. When foreign kings sent embassies to Egypt, they expected to receive gifts that exceeded the value of anything they brought. Royal marriages with foreign princesses required dowries, wedding celebrations, and ongoing support for foreign wives and their households. Treaty negotiations often included tribute payments or expensive concessions that drained royal resources. Funding trade expeditions to maintain international prestige and income required massive upfront investments with no guarantee of profitable returns. Royal trading missions had to be equipped with valuable goods for exchange, supplied with provisions for long journeys, and protected by military escorts. These expeditions could take years to complete, tying up resources while producing no immediate income. Failed expeditions represented total losses that had to be absorbed by the royal treasury. Tomb construction projects consumed resources over multiple decades, representing ongoing financial commitments that could outlast entire reigns. Royal tombs weren't just burial sites, but eternal palaces that required the finest materials, the most skilled craftsmen, and decades of labor. The pharaoh had to fund these projects throughout his lifetime, while also maintaining current royal expenses and preparing for succession costs. Expected generosity during festivals and public ceremonies created seasonal spikes in royal spending that had to be planned and funded throughout the year. Religious festivals required massive expenditures on food, entertainment, decorations, and gifts for participants. The pharaoh was expected to provide public banquets, sponsor athletic competitions, and distribute valuable prizes to winners. These celebrations couldn't be reduced or canceled without undermining royal legitimacy. No concept existed of separating personal and state expenses, meaning the pharaoh funded everything divine from a single royal treasury that had to cover both household costs and government operations. Modern leaders can distinguish between official and personal spending, but pharaohs were personally responsible for every aspect of divine governance. Royal family expenses, palace maintenance, religious ceremonies, military campaigns, and government administration all came from the same budget that had to be managed without modern financial instruments or economic expertise. The financial pressure was so intense that some pharaohs died bankrupt despite controlling the wealth of an entire civilization. Royal tombs that should have contained vast treasures were sometimes nearly empty because the pharaoh had spent everything maintaining divine status during his lifetime. The ultimate irony was that the very spending required to prove divine favor could leave pharaohs too poor to afford proper burial, undermining their chances for eternal divine status in the afterlife. Economic advisors didn't exist in the modern sense, leaving pharaohs to make complex financial decisions based on religious tradition rather than sound economic principles. Emergency taxation during crises often required confiscating temple treasures or wealthy estates, creating permanent enemies among the most powerful people in the kingdom. When desperate for funds, pharaohs might raid temple treasuries that had been accumulating donations for centuries, justifying these seizures as temporary borrowing for national emergencies. But temples rarely forgot these confiscations, and priestly resentment could persist for generations, creating ongoing political instability that required additional spending to manage. Managing succession as a pharaoh was like running a deadly reality TV show where all the contestants are your own children. And losing means not just elimination, but potentially execution. Multiple sons from different wives created dynastic competition and conspiracies that could turn the royal family into a war zone. Every pregnancy was a potential political crisis. Every birth changed the power dynamics, and every child represented both hope for dynasty continuation and a threat to existing claimants. The timing of heir designation created impossible dilemmas that could destabilize the kingdom regardless of the ruler's choice. Designating a successor too early could create rival power centers within the palace, as ambitious courtiers would begin positioning themselves around the future king. The designated prince might develop enough independent support to challenge the current pharaoh's rule. Or he might become a target for assassination by supporters of other potential candidates. Waiting too long to name a successor risked civil war and dynasty collapse after the king's death, as multiple claimants could emerge with equally valid arguments for legitimacy. Without clear designation, the kingdom could face years of internal conflict while different factions fought for control. Foreign enemies might exploit these disputes to invade Egypt or support rival candidates who would be more favorable to their interests. Balancing competing claims of royal women and their sons turned the royal household into a complex political battlefield, where family dinners became strategic planning sessions. Each wife had powerful motivations to advance her son's claims while undermining the prospects of her rival's children. These weren't just personal preferences, but survival strategies, because the mothers of unsuccessful claimants often faced exile, imprisonment, or death when succession disputes were resolved. Managing ambitious relatives with potential dynastic claims added another layer of complexity to planning that could involve dozens of potential competitors. Brothers, uncles, cousins, and even more distant relatives might have legitimate arguments for royal command based on bloodline, military success, or political support. The pharaoh had to keep these relatives close enough to monitor their activities, but not so close that they could organize effective challenges to his designated prince. Succession disputes could turn deadly, as the harem conspiracy demonstrated with devastating clarity. Queen Tea's attempt to murder Ramesses III and place her son on the throne shows how far royal women were willing to go to secure their children's inheritance. The conspiracy involved over 30 people and required years of planning, revealing the sophisticated political networks that could develop around succession disputes. The challenge of preparing heirs while maintaining current authority created constant tension between education and control. The designated heir needed to gain experience in governance, military leadership, and religious duties that would prepare him for kingship. But too much experience could make him impatient for power, while too little could leave him unprepared for the responsibilities of divine rule. Royal children grew up knowing that their relationships with siblings weren't just family bonds, but political calculations that could determine their survival. Half-brothers weren't playmates, but potential enemies who might someday order their execution. Sisters weren't confidants, but political assets whose marriages could strengthen or weaken different succession claims. Family love was a luxury that few royal children could afford. The succession system created perverse incentives, where the pharaoh's death might be secretly welcomed by ambitious family members who saw it as their opportunity for advancement. This meant the pharaoh couldn't trust even his closest relatives during times of illness or crisis, when their loyalty mattered most. The very people who should have been supporting the pharaoh during difficult times might instead be positioning themselves to benefit from his demise. Teaching divine responsibilities while maintaining supreme control created an impossible balancing act that could destroy both teacher and student. The king had to share enough knowledge and experience to prepare his successor for kingship, without giving away so much influence that the prince became impatient for transition. It was like training your replacement while making sure they don't try to replace you before you're ready to retire. Except retirement meant death, and mistakes could destroy an entire civilization. Sharing governmental experience without losing control over administration meant allowing the prince to participate in decision-making, while ensuring he understood that final command still rested with the current ruler. The designated successor might be given responsibility for specific provinces or government departments, but his decisions could be overruled at any time. This created frustrating situations where the prince had enough responsibility to be blamed for failures, but not enough influence to implement his preferred solutions. Ensuring the prince gained military experience without creating a rival command base in the army presented particularly dangerous challenges. The future ruler needed to understand warfare, command troops, and earn the respect of military leaders who would eventually serve under him. But successful military leadership could make the successor popular with soldiers who might support him in a coup against his father. Some kings dealt with this by rotating their princes between different military commands to prevent them from building lasting loyalties. Religious training was essential but couldn't be rushed, because mistakes in cosmic responsibilities could have catastrophic consequences for the entire kingdom. The successor had to learn hundreds of rituals, understand complex theological concepts, and develop relationships with powerful priests who controlled vast resources. But religious education also meant sharing divine command that was supposed to be unique to the reigning king. Protecting the designated successor from palace rivals and conspiracies became a full-time security operation that consumed enormous resources and attention. Ambitious courtiers might try to assassinate the heir, corrupt him with bad advice, or manipulate him into challenging his father's authority prematurely. The pharaoh had to maintain surveillance networks that monitored everyone who had contact with the heir, while ensuring that the security measures didn't isolate him from experiences necessary for leadership development. Managing the transition between established practices and necessary innovations required delicate negotiations between father and son that could easily escalate into open conflict. The heir might have new ideas about governance, religion, or foreign policy that conflicted with his father's approach. If the pharaoh suppressed all innovation, he could damage the kingdom's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But if he allowed too much change, he might undermine his own authority and legacy. Preventing premature succession attempts by ambitious heirs meant constantly evaluating the designated successor's loyalty, while providing him with enough responsibility to maintain his interest in eventual legitimate succession. Some heirs became so frustrated with their limited authority that they organized coups against their fathers. Others became so comfortable with their subordinate status that they never developed the confidence necessary for independent leadership. The educational process for future pharaohs was complicated by the need to maintain secrecy about royal weaknesses and limitations that could be exploited by enemies. The heir needed to understand the real challenges of kingship, including financial problems, military threats, and political opposition. But too much knowledge about royal vulnerabilities could make the heir a security risk if he was captured by enemies, or if his loyalty became questionable. Balancing the development of the heir's independent judgment with the requirement for absolute obedience to current royal authority created psychological conflicts that could damage both relationships and decision-making abilities. The future pharaoh needed to learn to think critically and make difficult decisions under pressure. But he also had to accept that his father's word was law, and that questioning royal decisions could be interpreted as disloyalty or even treason. Worry about the heir's ability to maintain divine authority after transition consumed enormous mental energy that should have been focused on current governance challenges. The pharaoh had to constantly evaluate whether his designated successor had the intelligence, charisma, and political skills necessary to hold the kingdom together after his death. Second-guessing this choice could lead to last-minute succession changes that destabilized the entire royal family and government. Concern about the kingdom's territorial integrity surviving leadership change reflected the reality that many enemies would view succession periods as opportunities for invasion or rebellion. Foreign rulers might test a new pharaoh's resolve with border raids or diplomatic challenges. Internal rebels might assume that a young or inexperienced ruler would be easier to overthrow than his predecessor. The pharaoh had to prepare his heir for immediate military and political challenges that would begin the moment succession occurred. Fear of being remembered as a weak or failed pharaoh by future generations created additional pressure to ensure that his reforms and achievements would survive beyond his death. The heir might reverse his father's policies, abandon his construction projects, or even erase his name from monuments to establish his own independent legacy. Some pharaohs tried to prevent this by involving their heirs in major decisions, making them co-responsible for policies they might otherwise reject. Anxiety about religious and political reforms surviving beyond death led some pharaohs to implement changes gradually, or to build broad consensus for their innovations before succession occurred. Revolutionary changes that depended entirely on royal authority might be reversed immediately by successors who wanted to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. But gradual reforms might not accomplish enough during the pharaoh's lifetime to secure his historical reputation. Ensuring proper tomb preparation and afterlife security, while managing succession planning, created competing demands for time, attention, and resources. The pharaoh needed to oversee his own burial preparations, while also ensuring that his heir was ready to take power. If he focused too much on death preparations, he might neglect succession training that was essential for kingdom survival. If he focused too much on succession, he might arrive at death unprepared for the spiritual challenges of the afterlife. Dynasty preservation during immediate political and military crises required the pharaoh to balance short-term survival needs with long-term succession planning. Wars, famines, or economic problems demanded immediate attention that might prevent adequate heir preparation. But neglecting succession planning during crises could leave the kingdom vulnerable to even greater disasters when leadership transition occurred. The ultimate fear was that everything the pharaoh had accomplished during his reign would be destroyed by an incompetent or disloyal successor who would disgrace the family name and dynasty. Unlike modern leaders who can retire and watch their successors from a safe distance, pharaohs had to trust their life's work to heirs whose true character and abilities might only be revealed after it was too late to make changes. Legacy anxiety often led to micromanagement of succession planning that actually increased the chances of failure by preventing heirs from developing independent leadership skills. Pharaohs who tried to control every aspect of their successor's preparation might produce heirs who were well trained, but incapable of making decisions without guidance that would no longer be available. The awareness that dynasty survival depended entirely on successful succession created pressure that affected every royal decision and relationship. The pharaoh couldn't simply focus on being an effective ruler, but had to constantly consider how his actions would affect his heirs' future prospects and the dynasty's long-term survival. Every policy, every alliance, and every conflict had to be evaluated for its impact on succession planning, as well as immediate effectiveness. So here we are, having walked through the golden prison of pharaonic power. Behind every gleaming death mask and towering monument lay a human being crushed under impossible expectations, divine responsibilities, constant assassination threats, genetic consequences of forced marriages, and the weight of cosmic order itself. The pharaohs had everything we think we want: unlimited power, vast wealth, and worship as living gods. Yet they lived lives of isolation, paranoia, and suffering that would break most of us within months. They remind us that sometimes the greatest curses come disguised as the greatest blessings, and that being treated like a god might be the most human form of torture ever devised. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the stranger corners of history. Until we meet again in another time and place, may your own burdens feel lighter, knowing that even the gods among men once carried weights too heavy for any mortal soul.